Professor Hart is Edwin Kyle Professor of Christian Studies in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Virginia. Professor Hart works primarily between the worlds of philosophy and theology, and also in the field of religion and literature. He's currently editing Jean-Luc Marion, The Essential Works, for Fordham University Press, and he's also in the process of revising essays to be included in two collections, one that is provisionally entitled The Iconic Moment, Poetry and Christianity, and another with the working title from the French, Essays on French Philosophy and Theology. His main project, though, is on the phenomenology of the Christ. He co-edits a series of books, Thresholds, Philosophy and Theology, for Notre Dame University Press, and he serves on the Comité Scientifique d'Œuvre d'Emmanuel Levinas, and sits on the editorial board of Cahiers Blanchot, Christianity and Literature, Expositions, Faith and Philosophy, the Journal of Cultural and Religious Theory, New Literary History, and the New Literary History. He's currently working on a study of Catholic contemplation, provisionally entitled Contemplation to the Kingdom of Silence. The book seeks to show that on the one hand, the Catholic contemplative tradition, especially in Richard of St. Victor, foreshadows phenomenology as the development in the 20th century, and on the other hand, that phenomenology in the 20th century can learn a great deal about the scope of manifestation by reading Richard. The book covers a variety of other topics, but is at present in a fluid state and is being written. So Professor Hart is also an accomplished poet. I don't know if you knew that. And he's published many works, including Barefoot and Wild Track, which I think are fantastic works of poetry. Now, today he will address us on a topic of contemplation and phenomenology, a topic of his recent research. And I'm very pleased that Professor Hart was able to be with us this afternoon, particularly in the context of some difficulties back home, I know. So Professor Hart, over to you.
Thank you, Gavin. Can you hear me? Jolly good. The title of this lecture is Husserl and Contemplation. And I'll simply read it. Sometimes an entire philosophy can appear to reconfigure itself when regarded from the viewpoint of meta-philosophy. Of course, the use of the singular can be troublesome here, for philosophies do all sorts of things, both technical and non-technical. Nonetheless, the history of modern philosophy shows us a range of things which important philosophers think they're doing. With Kant, there comes a heavy emphasis on philosophy of critique. With Anglo-American philosophy, an orientation to analysis, among other things. With Shestov, a conception of philosophy as struggle. With Peirce, the discipline is deflated to pragmatics. With Durkheim, it is in the service of offering a worldview. With the later Wittgenstein, it becomes a therapy to help one overcome false philosophical problems. With Quine, it is a handmaiden to natural science, while for Adorno, it is a means of social emancipation. Seen from this perspective, Husserl's conception of philosophy is unusual. For him, it is contemplative or reflective. His preferred words for talking about it are Besinnung and Reflexion. I shall say something about the word contemplative in a moment. Now there's some attention to the notion of meta-philosophy is in order. One must be very careful when speaking of meta-philosophy. In an apparently perfectly straightforward sense, it is no more than the philosophy of philosophy. The discipline takes itself as an object of investigation, much as it does with history, science, or art. Within this general conception, one might take meta-philosophy to situate itself above or beyond philosophy as routinely practiced, an inquiry into its assumptions, methods, and aims. One might also take meta-philosophy to be a final philosophy, and hence an examination of everything that has been assumed and achieved in all branches of learning. And here it is possible for philosophy to exceed itself and become something else, a dialectic, an encyclopedia, a history of religion, and so on. Hegel supplies an example. Husserl adopts a middle position, thinking of philosophy as a sort of theoria that can be undertaken only from the very bounds of the world, by which he understands the general thesis, namely that the world around one is constituted exactly as it appears without reference to consciousness. This theoria derives from Plato and Aristotle. It is reflection on the intelligible structures of reality and has no reference to the Roman templum or to the early and continuing Christian practice of contemplatio. Such reflection need not be pursued in an even manner. One might attempt to reflect on the nature, tasks, and methods of one's epistemology, but not of one's metaphysics, for instance. Although if one acts, one will surely have an implicit metaphysics partly in place. With Husserl, there is an orientation to philosophy as contemplative, while also a post-Kantian project of establishing philosophy as a rigorous science and renewing European thought after the turmoil of the First World War. This interest in foundations is not in itself, however, a hunt for unshakable conditions for epistemic judgments and the consequent trimming of metaphysics. If anything, for Husserl, Kant becomes fully readable only through the lens of phenomenology. Nor, I think, should we account for being drawn to foundations in idealist terms. But disentangling phenomenology from idealism, a delicate task that requires a close reading of Husserl's sense of idea, closer to Plato's sense than Kant's, and important essays by Paul Ricoeur, is not something to which I shall return today. I do not wish to give the impression that Husserl is quite alone in his conception of philosophy. That he uses the Greek word theoria already bespeaks much, and one could easily devote much time to establishing what he takes from Plato and Aristotle and the manner of his classical inheritance. And that Husserl learned a tremendous amount from post-critical German philosophy goes without saying. Perhaps, though, it still needs to be said that he learned more than has been admitted from the very first philosopher he read, and one whom he taught on 2 occasions, Schopenhauer. It is Schopenhauer who develops the light stress initially put on contemplation in the critical philosophy, especially in the critique of judgment, but who orients it even more surely towards aesthetics rather than religion. My concern here is restricted to this movement, which is by no means straightforward. After all, what is one saying when one proposes that philosophical contemplation can replace its religious counterpart? What notions of equality, sufficiency, or meaning are presumed, and to what ends? More broadly, we might figure the movement by way of the abandonment of contemplation, by way of the allegorical hermeneutic, to a new hermeneutic of contemplation, one more philosophical, in the general sense, than theological. Religious contemplation is of interest to the phenomenology of religion. More generally, and in another key, it is an irreducible dimension of Husserlian phenomenology. One unexpected aspect of this dimension of phenomenology is what it might reveal of the quest for understanding. My examples will converge on poetry, for my larger project in recent years has been the association of contemplation and poetry that proposes contemplation in a religious sense, and poetry that adopts contemplation in an aesthetic sense. We might say that religion and poetry both point us to the central concern of this colloquium, what it is to be human. We do not know what Husserl said in his seminars for the most part, but in his published writings, at least, he was not drawn to Schopenhauer's doctrine of the will. He sympathized with the idea of contemplation releasing us, if only momentarily, from the domination of the principle of sufficient reason, however. That is a way of putting things that we might more quickly associate with Heidegger's middle period. Yet, as is quite often the case, we have been taught, partly by Husserl and Heidegger themselves, to read these two philosophers more by way of contrast than by way of consilience. There is a Husserl who objected to technique, especially in the natural sciences, and who attended to the hermeneutic as if, just as there is a Heidegger who changed his mind, not about philosophy being contemplative, which he always held to be an unfortunate move on Husserl's part, but of thinking being meditative rather than calculative. To be sure, it is Heidegger, not Husserl, who looks to the poetry of Hölderlin and other German poets to encourage us in the meditative practice he calls thinking. And this in itself must be recognized to be an original figure. For the Western tradition, which gains high clarity with the Victorines, is quite clear in its distinctions between thinking, meditating, and contemplating. And Heidegger seeks to rehabilitate thinking by way of meditating in particular. That said, Husserl is plain that the phenomenologist and the poet are kin. The poet's gaze always settles upon a phenomenon, just as the philosopher's does. Yet the philosopher is concerned to ground the meaning of the world as phenomenon, which can be done only in a philosophy which does not rely on imported presuppositions from the positive sciences. This is the meaning of phenomenology as self-founding, which is quite different from laying down incontrovertible first principles. Philosophers then seek to give full phenomenological description of phenomena, while poets content themselves with describing phenomena without an appropriate sequestering of their psychological processes or their rhetorical resources. There is a poetry informed by phenomenology, and there is a poetry informed by the French imperative tout dire, but the former is thankfully not written by Husserlians of rigorous observance, and the latter is a restricted practice. Raymond Roussel and A.R. Ammons giving us different indices of it. Philosophy for Husserl is reflective in the sense that consciousness can always take itself as an object. This can be understood in two ways. First, one can remain within what Husserl will come to name the natural attitude by way of what Kant calls the I that intuits itself. One can inspect this ego and study its temporal profiles, since consciousness has no spatial ones, which is one reason why we go to it when in search of certitude. Such is the philosophizing that occurs most notably in the second volume of the Logical Investigations, Phenomenological Description, with an awareness of consciousness investments in it. Second, however, one can question the general thesis and thereby trouble one's acceptance of the natural attitude. And this marks the philosophy of Husserl's second maturity, associated with the 3 volumes of Ideas. Such questioning does not occur in the normal course of events, however. It must be prompted. Husserl calls this spur hypoke, the Greek word for suspension of judgment, and it can assume many forms, which are not restricted to those that appeal to Husserl's own ways of thinking as a mathematician and logician. Put concisely, it stimulates a change from seeing the world as pre-given to regarding it as given. In order for this to happen, the world, as posited by the general thesis, must be set in brackets or suspended altogether, Husserl says. This is dissimilar from abstaining from judgment about something in the world. For when one suspends the world, all my acts, all my experiences, including other people, animals, and their acts, one is set to perform reduction. Husserl takes the word in its full Latin sense to mean leading back, by which he wishes to convey reverting to the very margin of the world one has been naively inhabiting. It is not a matter of leaping over one's shadow or of unhumanizing oneself, only a question of excluding oneself as a participant in worldly acts, and becoming a neutral observer of those same acts. One begins to grasp that how one directs oneself at something is correlated with how the phenomenon manifests itself. Reduction can occur in all sorts of ways, have disparate strengths, can point in various directions, and can pose distinct problems for the person attempting it, one of which is if one can say with all rigor that a single person is its agent in any simple sense. Husserl himself explored several paths of reduction, most notably the Cartesian and the ontological, although he became dissatisfied with the celerity of the former. It never quite delineated consciousness as a field of activity. In conversation with Dorian Kahns and Eugen Fink in November 1931, he observed that a conversion of the gaze can happen simply by noting that the world, which we're told exists in itself, always appears to me as experiences that apply to my own subjectivity. It is a concise formulation of what prompts the ontological path of reduction, one that is regressive in that the passage one undertakes is from transcendent being to phenomenon. The same path can be broached by shifting from asking our habitual questions that are sponsored by the principle of sufficient reason, the where, when, why, and wherefore of things, as Schopenhauer puts it. Instead, one would ask how, not in the spirit of how does it work, but how does it appear? The major point at issue is that when led back from a position from which one can question the general thesis, one becomes what Husserl will eventually call a disinterested spectator. Where Kant thought that one must be disinterested in order to make an aesthetic judgment about a natural scene or an artwork, Husserl maintains that one must cultivate that state so as to contemplate the world and its people, regardless of beauty or sublimity. It is, he thinks, as he makes clear in his comments on Finck's sixth Cartesian meditation, what makes us most human. Phenomenology, then, is not part of the natural course of life. Phenomena disclose themselves only when one is no longer captive to the natural attitude. And one does not begin phenomenology merely by changing attitudes, for there are quite a few of them, some nearer to the mentality of phenomenological openness and others further from it. If one engages in mathematics, chemistry, or physics, for example, one quickly and seamlessly adopts the theoretical attitude. If one takes a class in robotics or prosthetic technology, one will find oneself taking on the naturalistic attitude, which overlays the natural attitude and makes it all the more rigid. If one takes an interest in the beauty of a tree outside the window, one will pass to the aesthetic attitude. The affective, axiological, practical, and willing attitudes speak for themselves. And if one begins to think religiously, Husserl surmises, one will slip into the mythical religious attitude. When reading the adjective mythical here, we should not think of how Bultmann was to use the word in the early 40s and thereafter. For Bultmann, myth is incompatible with the scientific worldview we all unquestionably follow with narrower or broader borders. More importantly, it includes the kerygma, proclamation of the gospel, and hence must be identified and sheared away to let the proclamation be heard. Husserl uses myth in a more affirmative manner in order to pick out those narratives which account for the communities and traditions in which we live, their origins, and what develops from them. It is one of the signs of Husserl's interest in generative phenomenology. Each of these attitudes must be willed, at least tacitly, although ingrained habit often occludes the resolve that must initiate and sustain them. One might also notice effortlessly sliding into the personalistic attitude, as in one's usual relations with other people, which Husserl will figure in his late work as part of the Lebenswelt, or life world. For example, I shake hands with a friend I meet downtown. Even if I were to be an eliminative materialist, I would not respond to him or her as another cognitive unit and concern myself whether folk psychology is mistaken in its commonsensical attitude to mental acts for the period in which we chat. I respond to my friend only as another person, and for a while the natural attitude has less of a hold over me. It is possible to change attitudes, often in certain circumstances, and do so without preparation or awareness. If I'm reading a poem I love, I am momentarily caught up in it. But if I put down the book and reflect on what I've been reading, I immediately pass from one attitude to another. I'm no longer living in the enjoyment of the poem, in the affective attitude, but in the theoretical attitude, even though I might still be experiencing pleasure from what I have read. In quite other circumstances, one might require mental exercises, including prayer, to make one or another shift. Of particular interest to Husserl is what he calls the phenomenological attitude, which one reaches by reduction and undergoes what Finck memorably describes as the awful tremor of realizing that what was once taken as absolute is only one way of inhabiting the world, and perhaps not the best one. Only if one gains this particular frame of mind can one discern the correlations between consciousness and the world. Unlike the other frameworks, achieving the phenomenological attitude involves a total change of mindset, as Husserl observed from the first volume of Ideas until his last writings. Like Christian metanoia, it also presumes a firm resolve to remain in it unless one is content to be a philosopher only for an hour, though doubtless there are backsliders in phenomenology as well as in Christianity. One can begin to contemplate how the world is given in a flow of representations that appear not in the empirical ego, but in another aspect of the ego, which Husserl, following Kant, but giving the word a new twist, calls transcendental. Kant wrenches transcendental from its medieval contexts, so that for him it denotes the subjective conditions of experience. Husserl uses the same word to specify the universal structures of experience, which are discovered only in and through the reduction. Other main differences between the two philosophers here are that for Husserl, the ego is not atemporal, and the key philosophical question is not how things, and indeed the world, are known, but how they are given. The point is not to secure objectivity, but to understand it, as Husserl says in The Crisis. In other words, for Husserl, the ego is temporal, and its experiences are to be described by way of static, genetic, and generative analyses. To attain the phenomenological attitude is an achievement, as Husserl sees it. It opens up an entirely new field of being, the sphere of transcendental experience. It is easy to be mystified by this expression, especially if one approaches it from just having read Kant. To him, it would have been a contradiction in terms. We cannot experience the transcendental at all. Husserl himself can be overly fussy in his many delineations of the procedure, all undertaken, it must be said, in the interest of achieving high levels of clarity and rigor. And he can be overly dramatic in his presentation of the reduction. Even one of Husserl's most devoted students, Roman Ingarden, thought that phenomenological reduction leads only, and I quote, to a fairy world. Another of Husserl's students, Eugen Fink, contended that the phenomenological reduction entangles one in circular reason, since it presumes what it seeks to find. Husserl's language can often be ambiguous or even misleading. For example, one must be careful not to think that in reduction, one is passing from one ego to another, from the empirical I to its hidden transcendental counterpart. There are not two egos in the sense of two distinct entities. The transcendental ego is the set of conditions for a disinterested examination of phenomena, and it is from these conditions that one sees that the natural attitude comes not from any misuse or restriction of the empirical ego, but from the transcendental ego. What is revealed in reduction, then, is not another world, but the intelligible structures of the one in which we live, in all its natural, social, and cultural aspects, which includes the structures of things that we imagine. Reduction does not in any way disregard or diminish the accomplishments of anyone who works even unreflectively in the natural attitude. It is no procedure for validating an earlier version of idealism, whether epistemic or metaphysical, subjective or absolute, which is not to say that it has no relations whatsoever with idealism. Rather, it allows us to contemplate the activities of the ego, which includes how certain human activities at an angle to everyday life in the natural attitude, doing philosophy or science, writing and reading poems, light up life as we actually live it. And once one has made the reduction, one cannot fully return to a state of naivete with respect to the apparent naturalness of fit between mind and world. One thinks of Wordsworth's thought in the preface to The Recluse, how exquisitely, too, the external world is fitted to the mind. And then one will think of Blake's riposte. You shall not bring me down to believe such fitting and fitted. I know better and please your lordship. Or we might think of Plato's prisoner who escaped from the cave and how he can only imagine his former captivity. But Husserl's point is that after reduction, one lives with a new question. How does something appear? Not what is this being? Husserl explained the intelligible structures by way of noetics, the study of thinking, which for him includes the examination of the relation of noesis, intellectual apprehension, and noema, that which is thought. Just as Schopenhauer took a tree as his example for aesthetic experience, which is the contemplation of the idea, so Husserl also chooses a tree, not once but twice, to illustrate the noema. The first passage reads as follows. The tree simply, the thing in nature, is nothing less than this perceived tree as such, that belongs, as the sense of the perception, to the perception, and does so inseparably. The tree itself can burn up, dissolve into its chemical elements, and so forth. The sense, however, the sense of this perception, something necessarily inherent to its essence, cannot burn up. It has no chemical elements, no forces, no real properties. The noema is not an essence then, but a correlate of consciousness. The second passage occurs just a few pages later. In one unified consciousness, we observe this tree here, first standing still where it is, then appearing to be moved by the wind. All the while, it affords itself in quite different manners of appearance as we change our spatial position toward it, stepping toward the window, or merely altering the position of our head or eyes, first relaxing our focus, then sharpening its turn, and so forth, while continuing to observe it. In this way, the unity of one perception can contain in itself a great variety of modifications. As observers in the natural attitude, we ascribe this manifold one time to the actual object as changes in it, another time to a real and actual relation to a real psychophysical subjectivity, and ultimately to this subjectivity itself. What matters now, however, is describing what remains of this as a phenomenological residuum, if we reduce it to pure immanence, and what should count thereby as a really obtaining integral part of the pure experience, and what should not. And that means making perfectly clear here that on the one hand, the perceived tree as such, or the full noema, that remains untouched by the suspension of the actuality of the tree itself and the entire world, is part of the essence of the perceptual experience in itself, but that on the other hand, this noema, with its tree in quotation marks, is not contained in the perception as really inhering in it, any more than the actual tree is. Now, of the many entangled threads in this text, I draw out just two. First, the philosopher, the one who lives within phenomenological reduction, can contemplate the noetic-noematic correlation, namely how our thinking relates to what is thought. Second, the one gazing upon the tree does not lose himself or herself in a Platonic idea, as for Schopenhauer, but apprehends the noema, that is, the tree exactly as perceived, or if the example were varied, as imagined or as remembered, and so on. The noematic structure of the tree is in one's subjectivity, but as real within the noetic act, but not an inherent ingredient of it. This intelligibility, this correlation between our intentional acts and phenomena that disclose themselves, can be found in distinct ways. I've already mentioned one. Another is by way of the theoretical attitude. For to have adopted this mental framework is already to have departed slightly from the natural attitude. Advanced math and theoretical physics often lead one a fair way from common sense. And even when starting to read philosophy or theology, one sees the world as a little stranger than before. One can insouciantly slide from the theoretical attitude to the phenomenological attitude. Put otherwise, it is possible to shift from theoria as a scholarly mindset to seeing phenomena, which calls forth contemplation long before it settles into theory. With the conversion of the gaze, there comes thelma, wonder. Few philosophers have devoted as much attention to the imagination as Husserl has done, and few have appreciated it as much as he does. If Kant holds dear the faculty of the productive imagination in the first version of the Critique of Pure Reason, Husserl goes a step further when he makes the transcendental turn, observing, while flourishing the paradox, that fiction, in quotation marks, makes up the vital element of phenomenology, as it does of all eidetic sciences. Without imaginative variation, one would not be able to see essences. Perception and imagination are nonetheless distinct sorts of rapport with the world. Not that they differ in all ways, for Husserl points out that one can gain a fulfilled intuition by the imagination and not only by perception. The difference is that the former will have meaning but no reference. Like Kant, though, Husserl has little to say about poetry and poems. An exception occurs in a letter Husserl wrote to the poet Hugo von Hofmannsthal, who had visited him and his distant relation Melvin Husserl in Göttingen in December 1906. The poet presented the couple with an advance copy of his short dramas, which was more than dutifully read. The philosopher wrote an admiring letter to the author on the 12th of January 1907. The date is significant, for it was about then he was preparing to lecture for the first time on the reduction. And it is this philosophical concern, not literary appreciation, that animates most of Husserl's letter, from which I quote only a very short passage. The artist who observes the world in order to gain knowledge of nature and man for his own purposes relates to it in a similar way as the phenomenologist. Thus, not as an observing natural scientist, psychologist, not as a practical observer of man, as it were an issue of knowledge of man and nature. When he observes the world, it becomes a phenomenon for him. Its existence is indifferent, just as it is to the philosopher in the Critique of Reason. The difference is that the artist, unlike the philosopher, does not attempt to found the meaning of the world phenomenon and grasp it in concepts, but appropriates it intuitively in order to gather out of its plenitude materials for the creation of aesthetic forms. The poet proceeds phenomenologically to the extent that he or she grasps phenomena, regardless of whether or not they actually exist. Yet the philosopher is concerned also to ground the meaning of the world as phenomenon, and this can probably be done only in a philosophy that does not itself rely on imported presuppositions. Since phenomenology takes only what is given, without recourse to previously elaborated theories, it aims to be a self-founding discipline, which, as already noted, is not the same thing as the laying down of incontrovertible first principles. Whatever interpretations occur in the grasping of phenomena do not stem from outside the gaze, but leak into it from secondary passivity that has not been neutralized. Some philosophers might wish to live glassily in a perpetual noon, but for better or worse, we live in a world in which shadows fall across us. That Husserl did not fundamentally change his view of the aesthetic gaze after 1907 is clear from a conversation that Cairns reports having with him and Fink on December the 23rd, 1931. Husserl spoke of the aesthetic contemplation of a landscape as involving a neutralization of the normal doxic or thetic comprehension of the landscape. It is not the phantom of the landscape, but the natural objective landscape aspect, which is the aesthetic object. But the natural landscape is considered beautiful as phenomenon, not as existent object. In passing, he noted that the appreciation of goodness was not so based on a neutral phenomenon perception. When one says, "What a fruitful landscape," one is expressing a value appreciation which involves the positing or the quasi-positing of the existence of the landscape. When I gaze at a landscape in the aesthetic attitude, I do not see just its perceptual characteristics separated from its causal matrix. That's to say, I do not see what Husserl calls a phantom. I see the natural landscape as a correlative to my intentional consciousness. But what is beautiful is the interpreted phenomenon, not the landscape as such. For landscapes are neither beautiful nor ugly in themselves. It is the intentional relationship with something that confers aesthetic value. Such values are not inherent, they're formed by correlation. To this we might add that the generative community, the tradition or traditions to which one belongs, contributes passively to this value. There was a time when the Alps were not sublime, as we well know. Unlike Hart, however, Husserl considers a common layer in aesthetic appreciation, one in which the utility or potential utility of what is viewed is acknowledged. There is reason to doubt that phenomenology can be wholly self-founding, as Husserl wished it to be. The secondary passivity emerges as soon as one admits intersubjective life, and without considering such generative life, near or far, phenomenology would not be able to do justice to the richness of the world. It would retreat to solipsism, a position Husserl regarded as nonsense. Once I've acquired a natural language, even when I contemplate a phenomenon in complete silence and still my thoughts as much as possible, nonetheless I reflect on it in categories that have come to me from conversation and study. A language of pure expression might be the dream of a logician, but not of anyone else. A poet's phenomenology is non-foundational for Husserl, and to explore it is not thereby to dismiss the philosopher altogether, but to recognize other claims on us than those of absolute consciousness or the wrangles of realism and idealism. One of those claims comes from a regional ontology, empirical writing, which gives us a clue to a quasi-transcendental structure that invites an endless and sometimes exuberant play of text and context. There is no pressing need, though, to prize one region of culture over others, including those within nature and consciousness, as well as culture, as a response to realizing that language mediates our intuitions. If I stand in the woods, the trees give me their being sensuously. They also give it to me genetically, should I be attentive to them in the right way. If I remember walking in the woods, the trees give their being to me in memory, perhaps by way of recollections of following trails in different states or countries. However, if I recite to myself, stopping by woods on a snowy evening, Robert Frost's trees give themselves to me in language, as being without any of a tree's natural being. I imaginatively add to what is given to me in the poem by reference to my pre-predicative experience of the world. And if I recall thinking of that poem as part of my memory of a walk in the woods last year, while I'm currently standing in the woods, I will be given woods in a richer manifold. Different situations call for different acts of understanding. One does not need to have recourse to literary language to do justice to the thesis that language mediates our relations with the world. One does not even need to depart from Husserl. Although he seldom treats language as a theme, he was nonetheless alert to the power of language in reflections relating to his Cartesian meditations that he made in the summer of 1931. Considering the home world, the place where those to whom I am near are born, live and pass away, and which for me embodies normality, he observes, and I translate from the third volume of the Phenomenology of Intersubjectivity. The home world of man, which is the basis for the structure of the objective world, for him, or can become so for him, in ever more meaningful forms with higher development, is essentially determined by language. The home world of man is essentially determined by language. One's intersubjective life is essentially related to a shared language that precedes one's birth. This is not a philosophically purified language in which expression has been prized over indication. It presumably includes, for anyone who's lived a long time in Freiburg, the dialect there, as well as its characteristic accents, in French as well as in German, its speech rhythms, its idioms and slang, its expletives and exclamations, its tonalities, lexical stress, curious phrasings, and so on. Although higher development is significant, there is also much to be said for the earthiness of daily language that binds one to a place. Many manifestations of home come more from the sound of words than can appear as propositional content. Natural language relates to one's home, even when sentences and paragraphs are only partly constituted, not displaying anything like the full possibilities of expressiveness, not expression in Husserl's narrower sense, that are possible at any one time for the person writing and therefore constituting. Journalistic prose heard on the radio or read in a local newspaper discloses one's territory or territories if one listens to news from elsewhere, perhaps in another language. Even administrative English, with its toneless policy speak, concealed stipulative definitions of words, and its deployment of doublespeak, minimally announces one's institutional home in a college or university. Quite different is poetry, especially when written in a more thoroughly constituted language, one that manifests itself to the reader as well as revealing phenomena in that same language. It manifests a community or communities, tradition or traditions, even if what is revealed is distant, imagined, or belongs to another. I give a range of examples which I'll pass over. I will not always have affirmative experiences in this manner, however. Tennyson's The Idylls of the King, with its fantasy of Arthur founding an authentic British kingdom in the late 5th century, proposes a sense of community I find belated and plausible, and I read it, if I must, with a weary sense of being led astray from the norms I expect to find. And there are always poems that will strike me as alien for one reason or another. Some of them will shed their sense of difference over the years, while with others I must acknowledge the boundaries of my empathy or insist on my aesthetic values. Language in poetry can be constituted, both actively and passively, to a greater or lesser extent, and in a vast variety of ways. It's not a matter of appealing to an enshrined literary or poetic vocabulary, theme, or rhetorical stance. Rather, it is a question of language articulated with respect to shape and sound, providing a range of possibilities of expression. Literary criticism has proved itself highly adept at isolating many of these possibilities, sometimes formally, by way of grammar, prosody, and rhetoric, and at other times historically or socially, by way of representations or relations. Put highly schematically, familiar groups include allegoria, ductio, and inventio for medieval criticism, apostrophe, periphrasis, metabasis for neoclassical criticism, anaphora, antimetabole, and metaphor for romantic criticism, ambiguity, irony, and paradox for the new criticism, aporia, discontinuity, and mise en abîme for deconstructive criticism, and cultural production, social marginalization, and self-fashioning for new historicism. Each group could be expanded, with formal possibilities being augmented by historical or social ones, and vice versa, and other sorts of groups, such as genre and mode, could be added, which would cut across the divisions just given. Like other disciplines, phenomenology also contributes its own insights, some of which I've already mentioned: attitudes, intentionality, and regional ontologies. At any given time in history, literary criticism will look to one or another discipline while overlooking others. It wanders in the space between epistemic and ethical judgments. In the main, the more highly constituted the language, the more that is offered to contemplation, and not just neutrally. The materiality of language cannot be effectively reduced. If I read Wallace Stevens' poem, The Snowman, I do not get far before I'm prompted to pass from the world as being to the world as phenomenon. To begin with, I'm not asked to consider a snowman, but a man made of snow. The natural attitude has been peeled away at a corner, as it were, by a simple space between two words. And if I read Geoffrey Hill's Enunciations and reflect that the word is back with a tanned look, the world is no longer quite how it is usually presented to me, neither the world of events and words nor the world of Christianity in which Jesus is the word. Even a poet such as Philip Larkin the hews tightly to the natural attitude, writing in the plain style, likely disturbs the general thesis. That iconic poem, Mr. Bleeny, stages in a tableau 2 layers of reflection on how consciousness relates to the world of post-war England. The poem is a report of Larkin's consciousness, taking in the stratum of Bleeny's consciousness, as interpreted by his prospective landlady, and evaluating the projections of world with which it correlates. As Derrida says, the reduction is perhaps the very condition of literature. What he does not say is that reduction occurs in a great many ways, even more perhaps than Husserl countenanced. Even Husserl, connoisseur of logically refined language, engages in reduction when he reads his poet friend's dramas. As he admits, the poet does not go as far as the philosopher. Description satisfies the poet, as it were, and he or she has no desire to furnish complete phenomenological description. Or the description becomes more and more complete by the operations of tout dire. The transcendental never quite closes around a poem, not least of all because what often attracts us in a poem is a voice, the voice of another person, and the alterity of this voice resists reduction. One is confronted with an enigma that will not yield an essence. What Husserl does not tell us, though, is that the reader of poetry will always be faced with 2 levels at which to engage what is before him or her. At the level of proposition, one is invited to contemplate a truth that is presented as registration, report, or opinion. At the level of sentence, one is led to ponder the speaker's utterances, whatever they may be, and however they are articulated by syntax and with respect to genre and mode. And it often happens that there is a tension between proposition and sentence. For the one sentence might contain several propositions, or there may be just the one proposition spread over an entire stanza or poem. Reading will therefore require passing back and forth from one level to another, and highly constituted poems will keep manifesting meanings beyond any single reading. Rereading a poem over several years will reveal different layers of judgment about it, including memories of each reading and past anticipations, which may or may not have come to fruition, each of which may become the subject of reflection, teaching me something about myself and those from whom I've learned, as well as the poem. Schopenhauer and Husserl both centered their writing on the word idea, although each has his own sense of the word. In a way, each proposes the idea as what Schopenhauer calls the Sabbath of penal servitude of willing. For Schopenhauer, one is freed momentarily from the cycle of desire and frustration. And for Husserl, one can begin to understand the essences of things. All 3 follow a philosophical sense of contemplation, although only Husserl makes explicit remarks to that effect. For him, God transcends phenomenological inquiry. He rightly assumes that the divine transcendence exceeds that of mundane things and makes the interesting suggestion that if God appears, it could be only in the absolute stream of consciousness. Contemplation, then, must be of this world only. Yet Husserl perhaps is a little too quick to remove God from the picture. One does not have to engage a supernatural attitude in order to contemplate the deity. Although absolutely singular in having his existence and essence perfectly coincide, God also has attributes, including goodness, justice, power, wisdom, and truth, all of which are modes of divine love and open to contemplation without ever being able to be exhausted. From a Christian perspective, even an atheist who contemplates any one of these rises unknowingly closer to God. When one engages in lectio divina, one passes from lectio to meditatio to oratio, and from there to contemplatio. And that final temporary suspension before God has been enabled by each of the preceding 3 levels. Contemplation of God can occur in and through nature and in and through the kingdom, elements that are not rendered as themes in the mythical religious attitude. A hermeneutic of contemplation, to conclude, can be philosophical or theological, depending on the one who beholds. If we look back to include Schopenhauer, Coleridge, and Husserl, and beyond them to Richard of St. Victor, we can see several principles of the hermeneutic. The first is that, with caveats already noted, anything and everything can be contemplated, regardless of whether or not it even exists. An essence can be beheld in an act of understanding that might or might not be finite. Certainly, the understanding itself is imperfect. The second is that contemplation commends us to look at something, not through it to find its ground. In doing so, one may well lose oneself, as Schopenhauer testifies. But as Husserl points out, we will also find ourselves by way of becoming conscious of our intentional acts. In doing so, we will lose the world, at least as a comprehensive thesis. There are various attitudes one can adopt in varying degrees of volition in order to contemplate in particular ways. One can expect to find, from time to time, the aesthetic, affective, axiological, naturalistic, theoretical, and phenomenological attitudes adopted in poems as they are in life. When reading a poem, one can accept an invitation to ponder the relation of parts and whole, the twofold stretching of anticipation and recollection, the play of text and context, the levels of proposition and sentence, and disparities between history and fiction. One can behold what is brought about in a correlation of consciousness and sense. And by genetic analysis, one can uncover conventions and traditions in the noema of a text, traditions that are also apparent in generative analysis. Of course, one can also behold gaps in argument, perception, or evaluation, and at any point this could introduce suspicion. Although any phenomenon, any poem can be contemplated, it is more usual for some poems to call one to respond in this manner. In the modern hermeneutic of contemplation, no poem loves us, although we might come to love it, but not if we remain good Kantians. Not all poems grant dilatio mentis. Some poems cultivate mystery, rightly or wrongly, and if we find the latter to be the case, we surely will respond suspiciously. A mystification is phenomenologically distinct from a mystery, though. Finally, contemplation is not always passive, at least not while one is reading a rich work, for one thinks while reading, nor does it exclude action. The quest for understanding, whether animated by faith or reason, yields a deeper appreciation of what it is to be human, whether that be in the theatres of aesthetics, history, religion, science, or society. Thank you very much for your attention.